or pass the styling section so far? All right, I see some hands. So the people who got to that, did that seem easier than a lot of the other chapters? Something you could sort of work through? Okay, so unless somebody, and feel free to message me if somebody feels differently, as I was saying, unless somebody feels different, we're going to probably not have a class session on that. I may touch on it just at the start of, like, say, the next class. But we're not going to spend a whole session on that. And then the goal will be to start working into the Flux chapters for the following class. So styling the notes application should be a lot more straightforward than the other ones. And another great thing is you're working in CSS. So, you know, there's not so much your code's going to fail as your style's going to be funky. And play around with it, right? If you like a different style. So then we want to start moving towards the implementing Kanban and React and Flux bit here. And that's going to be at first, a lot of content. So I suspect it'll take a little while for us to talk about what's going on with that sort of model. Anyways, so I didn't plan on going through the styling chapter. What I was going to do, although I heard a lot of people saying they were interested in trying to work through the stretch goal on their own, is I was going to try and work through the stretch goal. So this class may pivot a little bit from what I was thinking, because I want to give people a chance to try and do that and then come back and talk about how that went instead. So the first thing that I had mentioned last class, and we just had a little bit of a conversation about it, is this function prototype bind that keeps showing up in our code from our Survive.js tutorial. Let me find a good example of it. I think the note, oh wait, hold on. Notes is a good example. So here's an example of that setup, right? This onDelete.bind null ID. And I said, you know, if somebody can look into that and try and figure out what's going on, and if they wanted to present. So Casey looked some stuff up and sent a link. And what I'm going to take is a little bit of time going over what this is doing. And it's not so critical that you understand the exact idea of bind. It's just a really good practice when you encounter something that you're not familiar with, to take a little bit of time and try and start learning about what's going on with it. And this one is a sort of complex behavior. Something complex is going on in here. So let's go to Google here so I have a pretty simple page. I don't really care. Actually, you know what? I might even just do this inside of a node console, because that should work too. Skip this version. Close this, close everything. All right, make you bigger. There we go. So if I'm just inside of Node, we can create a function to, I don't know, what do I want to have a function do? We can have it add something, or let's have it say hello to the person whose name we pass in, right? So let's just create a say hello function. Say hello equals a function. And it's going to be pretty simple. It's going to take an argument, name, and then just console log your day going. We've got a very simple function here, right? Nobody should feel like this is something that we couldn't write. And we can just pass in any name. So we're pretty comfortable with this concept, right? Easy. Now, let's instead, I'm going to build on this a little bit here. Let's say that say hello can take a couple different parameters. So I'll redefine it here. It takes a name, and it also takes a, what else should it take? It'll take a time of day, let's say, which is going to be some sort of string. But so now we're just going to modify it slightly. Console.log. How is your time of day going? This is a small change. Nothing major. Except now when we invoke it, we need to pass in a couple parameters. So if like I called it with just one, we get undefined for that second parameter because we didn't give it a value. It makes sense, right? Something we're all familiar with. So if I call it with two parameters now, since he just walked in, we'll just go with this. Oh no, I put a quote in the wrong place. What? Yep. All right, let's fix it.
A lot of traffic.
Were they traveling really slow and waving at people too? Yeah. All right, so we should all feel this is all nice and easy, right? Nobody's puzzled by what we're doing with this. So now I'm going to introduce what we were doing with this bind, and there's two things happening, but the part that I'm emphasizing is that second parameter. So in the bind here, it was passing in two parameters, null and ID. And I'm sort of going to gloss over the null part just for a moment, because that's not what I'm trying to emphasize here. So now I'm going to say, I'm going to call this say hello Jared, which is going to give you a little bit of a hint of what's going on here. What I'm going to do is take this say hello meth function, which is an object itself, because functions are objects in JavaScript, and I'm just going to call the bind method on it. I'm going to pass null as my first parameter. I'm not particularly worried about that first parameter right now, and Jared is the second parameter. It even sort of tells you something special is going on here. What this is function bound say hello. So it's giving me a little bit of magic there. So now, if I call say hello Jared, and I pass in, I don't know, Jared, what do you think is going to happen? We already know what would have happened up here, right? It got undefined for its second value because I didn't give it a second value. But take a guess. I mean, because one of the best things you can do if you don't know how something works is take a guess at what it's going to do, run it, and see if you were right or wrong. Say Jared twice. All right. What was that?
Like, you almost said like not your time of day. I think the department versus Jared, I think going to go on to the time of day.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I like that. That's saying the same thing, but digging deeper into the explanation as to why it will do that, right?
Yeah.
So what he was saying is the same thing. It'll say Jared twice, but what's happening is Jared is the value for time of day for the time of day argument. So let's test that theory. If that's what happens. Let's try it again. What if we do it without any parameters? What do we think might happen?
Is it going to use the last argument that you used? Because that article says that it creates and returns the first argument.
So what do you think? I mean, I guess the question I would have is, what do you think the output's going to be then? I think that's a plausible theory. She's like, I'm just going to run it. Perfect. So what happens? Hello, Jared. How is your undefined going? All right. So let's try. What if I say morning here? And I'm just going to run this one right away. So I've sort of tried a few different iterations here. I see some puzzled looks. I don't get what's going on, right? Okay, that's good. So I'm going to go back and try and pull up the wording, because I mean, I think it's good, but
It's above your class.
what it says here, yeah, that up there is, but here's the quote that you had or whatever. It creates and returns a new function, always receiving the first argument and using the global context. So now let's pull up the console again. This bind call here creates a new function, creates and returns a new function. So that's what ends up in say hello Jared, is a new function with its context, the global context, because of the null. That's the part we're sort of glossing over. But its first argument is always what we passed in here. So say hello Jared is sort of equivalent, if you will, to having
A saved argument.
a saved argument that's already passed into your function each time it's called. So now we only, the new say hello Jared only takes one argument, because the first argument will always be Jared. You can't change that because we already bound it to that with this bind method. So what it did is returned a whole new function that essentially passes in any of this as the first argument instead of needing it. I mean,
Is the bind statement, you can have multiple arguments, right? There's no limit to how many you can do, or?
let me double check real fast. I'm pretty sure that you can have as many as you want. So there's, yes, so there's two ways to do this in JavaScript, by the way. Or there's a few different ways. There's bind, and then just a minute. It may not note it down here. Oh, apply and call are sort of similar. So they're not exactly the same. But yeah, you can pass in as many arguments as you want. So now that we said that, let's say we want one. I can pass in as many arguments as I want into the bind. And what it'll do is bind to each one of the parameters of my function. So my original say hello function, this isn't going to show me the actual syntax of it. The one I have now, at least, takes two arguments. it takes name and time of day. And we also sort of showed how you could have a pre-bound one where the name is already set. So what if we want to create a new one? I'll call it say good morning. Class. Yeah, let's say class. Say good morning, class. So how could we create or have assigned to this say good morning class a new function that would always say good morning to the class when it was called using this bind approach?
Can't you do null, comma, and then quote class? And then that's gonna save it where it always says good morning class.
Well, it's always going to say class, but it's not always going to say morning right now because we haven't bound anything to these. We haven't bound anything to this second argument. We bound something to name for class, but this can take as many arguments as we want for bind, and it'll just bind to each one of the arguments in the function. So we could say morning here as well. And now we've got a function that takes no arguments because we're already pre-bound to the two values in what would have been our original one, and just returns with those already passed in.
So the null is what creates the return function. Class is what sets the first parameter, and morning is what sets the second parameter, and the fact that we did it all in that is what saves the first argument.
The null isn't really what creates. The null is sort of a red herring right now. You can almost ignore what the null is doing.
It's like an odd syntax that you just know.
Yeah, for now. I mean, I may come back to what it's doing, but ignore it for now. The null is it doesn't matter. It's setting your context that your function runs in. So if this was using, if our function used this dot because it cared about the object, it's looking for stuff on the object, that's what the null is related to, is what context it's in. But since we're not doing any of that, doesn't really matter. Yes?
The Slack chat says someone's on the second.
And that's usually, to be honest, that's what having to do it is making sure that you have the right context for your methods so that this means what you want it to mean inside of them. Whereas this is sort of a secondary way to use bind, is to pre-assign these parameters to your function. It's not a very idiomatic. And by idiomatic, that may be a term you've not heard. Idiomatic just means common way to do things in your language. So this isn't a very idiomatic way of doing stuff in JavaScript. It's sort of interesting to me that he used this approach, but you can do it. And I think it's useful to sort of learn that you can do that type of programming as well, because there are cases where it might make sense. Because we did a problem like this before where I didn't use bind. I used a different way of composing something where I pre-composed some functions, right? So let's do that again. Let's do add. It's a function that takes two numbers, right? And just returns num1 plus num2, right? So we wrote this before. And then I did a whole bunch of extra logic to do an add 5 type thing where we always add 5. Well, another way you could do that using this bind, any ideas? Let's say I want an add 5 method, and it's going to add 5 to whatever.
You could say add less, or you can create a whole new function under add 5.
Yeah, let's get a new function back, but we can do it with bind.
Did you want to use the same as the null that we just did?
null, because we don't really care about that first parameter because we're not using this anywhere in our function, right? So it doesn't matter.
Is this where you would put 5 and then you would say,
Now if we called add 5 and we pass in a number, we're just going to add 5 to it. Because basically all you got back was, or what it's doing is binding it so that when that gets called, the first parameter of the function will always be what you've set here. It's a little bit of magic. It's very much a functional programming paradigm. And
Jared, not to get down the rabbit hole here, but in some cases your parameters can have different meanings. They're not always numbers like an add function. So let's say you wanted to have a default for num2 and you just wanted to, arbitrarily still have the user input num1. Would you do your bind with 2 nulls and then 5? In that case, if that makes sense, is that possible?
no, I don't think that's possible because it would pre-bind those, and so your first parameter would end up being null. So if we did that, like add 5 equals add dot bind null like 5, because these aren't default values. These are what will be the value for that parameter. So then if we called like add 5 and we passed in 3, we're going to get back 5 because it's adding null to 5. So now if you want to do that, the newer syntax for default parameters like that is, and I think this should support it. I don't know if my version of Node will support it, but I think it will. So you could set some default parameters like num2 equals 0. And then that's just a default parameter. So if I pass in a couple numbers, I get them added up. But if I pass in just 1, then it assigns the default value to the second one, which is 0. And I could change that instead, right? If I wanted the default to be 5, I could do that. And now if I called add with 2 numbers, like 2 and 3, I get the result of that. But if I called it with just 1, I get 2 plus 5 because it uses the default value since I didn't give it an actual value. So no, I mean this is a little confusing, this bind stuff, but that's what's happening there is he's defaulting the first parameter. So let's go take a look at the onDelete function real fast. It gets passed in because that gets passed into our notes from somewhere else, if possible. And what is it? The app that calls notes? I believe it is. So let's take a look here at our render. Notes onDelete equals this dot delete note. So we're just going backwards through this code. So this dot delete note is what it gets mapped to. Probably gonna take a pause in a moment. And if we look at delete note, what are the 2 parameters that it expects? An ID and E. What is E? Event, right? So it expects an ID and an event. And over here, we're saying that we've already pre-mapped the ID value. So this was a very lazy way of hooking up this onClick event handler, because onClick by default will invoke the function passing in the event as the only parameter, the event that fired. And then this has already pre-bound the ID. So what actually gets called is delete note with an ID and the event. but the note itself didn't need to know anything about the method signature for it. It just passed in the event and got to call it very loosely, and it was bound at this level instead. Again, sort of a cool pattern, but not very idiomatic, not very common. So you probably won't encounter this all the time in any sort of JavaScript that you're writing. Any questions on that? Does that feel clearer at all? Does it make a little sense? Yeah? Little confusing still? It's just a lot of logic around function composition and partial evaluation. I'll be honest with you. I have watched probably like 3 hours of videos on topics like this, because this stuff does not come naturally to me. And that's after I've been programming for a long time. Like, trying to think this way is not simple for me. So I'm just like, like, don't feel like, oh man, this is a big challenge. I don't understand it. I keep reading and learning on this sort of concept because it's a little bit challenging, but it's also very, very powerful when you can learn to think that way. All right. When does this parade get going? Must be 11, I'm guessing. Yeah, let's look it up, because we're probably gonna have to take some sort of break when it's going. This is almost like who was there? Rondell? You were in my class then, right? Were you in my class for the St. Patrick's Day parade? No.
It's 11. It says Saturday, December 2nd, 11 a.m.
All right. So I wanted to run something by you guys then, because originally, like I said, the other thing I was planning to do today was work through the stretch goal, but I heard a lot of people say that they were planning to try and work through that. So I want to give you guys a moment to do that before we try and solve it as a class. I would love to have people come here with their own solutions so we can talk about different ways that people may have solved this problem. So this is going to be a little bit of a poll, a loose poll. I don't want us to change our focus too much from working through this book so that we can get done with it. But one thing that we just decided to do with some of my developers at work for fun, and this is sort of the 3rd year they've done this, is there's something called the Advent of Code that has been put on for a few years now. And it's just a little bit of a programming challenge to try and try and solve some problems with programming. It's through the month of December, right? Like an advent calendar or anything else like that, if you've ever seen those, which is you do something every day. And the idea is, here's just some little programming problems to solve each day for the month through the 25th. And there's no language that it's asking you to solve them in. It's mostly stuff where you just have an input value and you then tell it what the output value would be if you've written the program or the function correctly to solve that problem. And so you could code it in any language you want, and it's not tied to some framework like React or anything else. So this is where I just sort of a poll or something. Would people be interested in trying to work through some of these, or having it as a challenge to try and work through these? Or do you feel like it's going to take too much time or focus away from continuing to work through the Survive.js tutorial and making progress there? Because this would be more just core programming fundamentals and less about picking up a framework.
I think it would be helpful, but I also think I struggle just to be able to get some of the basic chapters just because of life issues.
Right.
Wait, so like day 25, you'd be solving 25 problems?
No, it's I believe it's 2 problems a day. So you solve the first one and then it gives you a second problem. They get progressively more difficult throughout the month. But what I'm going to do for this, because I think we're going to be doing it at my job anyways. So if people are interested in this, let me know and we can, I think it'd be awesome to talk about them and work through them. is I'm going to probably be solving them. I don't know if I'll keep up with it. We'll see how I do. But I'll be trying to solve them and post my solutions on GitHub. So I'll create a GitHub project for my code for this and then solve them in JavaScript and post the solutions each day up there. So if other people want to work through it, you guys can try and work through it too. And you'll have hopefully a reference for solutions, assuming that I've actually solved them.
Can you see the problems for like future days?
Nope. You only get to see it that day or earlier. So there's 2 available right now, right? Like if we go to the start of this, for me, and it sort of builds up a Christmas tree here, I think, is what it does. But the first day and the second day are the only ones available right now.
Does it get progressively harder?
It does, yeah. Yeah. I haven't done this in previous years, but I've tracked it a little bit, looked at some of it, and I know that they get more difficult. But it would be good practice of just solving problems. If people are interested, what I was going to sort of propose was doing something a little different right now for class, where I'll go over this first problem, and then just take maybe 30 minutes or something where we're not really talking, or I mean, you guys can talk, but it's not instruction. And collectively, people are just trying to work through, try to write a function or something that can solve this problem. And then we can come back and talk about what solutions people have and how they solved it. Although I think really important during that time window would be if you find any tools that help you solve it. Like, oh man, I found this method on arrays or method on strings, and it makes it so much easier to solve this problem or something, to mention it or write it on the board or something like that, so that we're sort of building a solution, like at least building a set of tools to solve the problem together, right? Not necessarily solving it the same way, but we might be saying, oh, here's a really awesome method to work on that. Anyone interested in just trying that out? If not, we can focus on the book a little more, but this is more of I've noticed that when we do some of these hands-on working through problems together, I feel like we're getting more engagement. You guys get to see a little bit more of what it takes to think about breaking down a problem and solving it. And I think that's really important, because it's hard when you don't get to see somebody breaking down problems who has experience doing that, and you're trying to break them down yourself. Yeah? All right, I feel like we'll try it for this, and if we don't like it, then we'll sort of ditch it and get right back onto the book. But let me give a quick overview of it then. You can go to the Advent of Code. Let me get just the raw link and post it. And then it asks you to link up to some accounts if you want to. But this first problem, the very first one that we're going to try and work through and solve, and do it in groups if you want, because that might help you solve the problem better. One person can look up resources, somebody else can be working on the code. Is relatively simple, although I found it took me several times reading through this to understand what it's saying. So it says the CAPTCHA requires you to review a sequence of digits. An example would be 1122. And then find the sum of all digits that match the next digit in the list. The list is circular, so the digit after the last digit is the first digit in the list. That's one of the more confusing parts. But I'll break this down real fast. It gives an example here. It says 1122 produces a sum of 3, 1 plus 2, because the first digit 1 matches the second digit, and the third digit 2 matches the fourth digit. Yeah. So what it's saying is, with 1122, what you would be doing is you check, all right, I've got the first digit. Well, that can't match the digit before it because there's no digit before it. But 1, yeah, that matches what was before it. So that digit is going to be part of our sum, right? Okay, now we're on 2. 2 doesn't match 1, so that's not part of our sum. 2, yep, 2 matches 2. So that's part of our sum. And then what it was saying was the first digit, it's the digit before it is the last one as well, right? So you can go 1, if you want to sort of wrap around here, 1, 2, no, 2 and 1, that's not the same, so it won't have that. So this one's just 3. And it's got a few other examples there as well, in case that's not clear or if somebody wants to work through it again. I think the 1, 1, 1, 1 is a good example of one, because it's a little tricky, right? Here what you're doing is you're going, all right, let's start here and go 1. Well, the last digit is also 1. So that's part of our sum. All right, this guy, yep, the digit before it is 1, so that's part of our sum. 1, yep, the digit before it is 1, part of our sum, and 1, yep, they're the same, so that's 4. So you're always checking the one before it. If the first one before it is the last digit, if you will, or if you want to think about it the other way, it wraps around. Does that make sense? All right. If people want to, we'll just take about 30 minutes, so about 11:20, or if everyone gets it solved before then, we'll try and work through it together. If you find some really good tools, some methods on the string or methods on array, or great ideas for how to solve it, feel free to talk about it or go write it up on the board, like the methods and stuff, so that other people have that as a reference, so that we can sort of build a solution together. And if you're stuck, maybe talk it over with somebody else about how we might try and solve this problem. Yeah.
Which of these digits does it keep talking about different numbers? All these numbers
Just a moment. I'm gonna check to see if I can pause, hang out real fast. All right, I don't know if I can pause this. So, given we're gonna have a 30-minute break for anyone who's actually watching the video, I'm gonna just stop the broadcast, start another one where we talk about the solution to this.